This year's keynote speaker is someone who's very special to Central's community and embodies what this week strives to accomplish. Dr. Cedric Taylor is a Jamaican-born sociologist and filmmaker and holds a position of associate professor at CMU. His teaching, research, and creative endeavors focus on racial health disparities, immigrant health, environmental justice, and visual sociology. Dr. Taylor is a public sociologist who employs storytelling through documentary film to engage the broader community in conversations around social inequality. He is the writer, director, and co-producer of the documentary film Nor Any Drop to Drink, Flint's Water Crisis, which has been screened throughout the country and internationally. He is also a past president of the Michigan Sociological Association. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Taylor.
I'd like to thank Julio for that gracious introduction. I'd also like to thank our Multicultural Academic Student Services, particularly Assistant Director Wade Thompson, and of course Julio Velasco for inviting me to participate in this year's MLK Junior Community Peace Brunch. To all of you participating virtually or in person, faculty, students, and other members of the Mount Pleasant community, good morning. It is an honor to, with you, reflect on the enduring legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who was the quintessential American hero, but who also had a global impact. As a Jamaican-born scholar, it's not difficult to see how the push for independence from European colonialism in many ways reflected and drew inspiration from Dr. King's struggle for racial equality in the United States. We celebrate his genius in forcing Americans to reckon with their moral selves, to acknowledge a common humanity in their brothers and sisters. And today, King continues to inspire those of us in the fight for human rights, that despite the daunting, inevitable obstacles that lie ahead, someday we shall overcome. Dr. King has a special place in our collective memory, but that memory is sometimes sanitized. For many of us, he is an abstraction, a caricature, a noble, safe, lofty, non-threatening idealist. And of course, this is based on an incomplete recollection of his I Have a Dream speech. The truth is, when you look at more than just a sliver of his life, you will see a more complete picture of who the man was. You'll see a man that was more complex, more radical, and more pragmatic than most people realize. Here's something you might find surprising. King was one of the most hated people in America during his lifetime. Today, we almost universally profess an admiration of the man. But in 1966, almost 2/3 of Americans had an unfavorable opinion of him. His focus on segregation in the North, in cities like Chicago, his anti-war stance in defiance of the presidency, and even the civil rights establishment, his anti-war campaign, his anti-poverty campaign, his calling for a universal basic income, his critique of unfettered capitalism were positions that were not in step with the times. Here is the thing. Dr. King's radicalism lay in his demand that America truly walked the talk. He dared to envision a beloved community where there was justice, equality of opportunity, and love. Dr. King is no longer with us physically, but his radical spirit lives on everywhere. It's right here in the Great Lakes State. We see it in the fight for clean, affordable water in Flint and against water shutoffs in Detroit. It's in the fight for preserving democracy and against the overreach of government in the form of emergency management. It's in the fight against voter suppression. It's evident in the ongoing struggle to protect our shorelines, the Mackinac Straits, from oil spills and other forms of contamination. We have seen it not far from here in the activities of the Pine River Superfund Citizens Task Force, demanding accountability and action. And we see it in the radicalism of the New America Project and the many other youth-led organizations on campus pushing for a fairer, more equitable community. We can say a lot of things about 2020. But one thing we must acknowledge was that it was a year of racial reckoning in the wake of George Floyd's murder. We saw people crossing all kinds of boundaries: age, race, the urban-rural divide, coming together all over the world to proclaim a most radical ideal that Black lives do matter. In light of what feels like a seismic cultural shift, the logical question is, what's next? Where do we go from here? Interestingly, Where Do We Go From Here was a title of Dr. King's final book before his assassination. And if you read that book, you will see the radicalism I've been talking about. In that book, he criticizes moderate American white folk for having inaccurate, unrealistic views of the ongoing plight of Black Americans, even though civil rights legislation had been passed. King wrote that the most troublesome adversary of the time was not the KKK. It wasn't the Bull Connors. It wasn't ultra-conservative fringe groups like the John Birch Society. It was, and I quote, the white liberal who is more devoted to social order than to social justice, who prefers tranquility to equality. That was most troublesome. Whenever there has been meaningful progress for people of color in America, it has not come without persistent pressure and agitation, discomfort, tension. That is par for the course. Let me be clear, it was a tension that was not destructive, but forces us to confront the ugly realities of racial injustice in America. It's not enough to say that you have Black friends or relatives that you love and care for. You must demand justice. Challenge the social order. Dr. King maintained that if America is to live up to its ideals, then, I quote, radical change is not only just, but it's necessary. Now, in light of what we have seen recently, let me very clearly draw a distinction between challenges to the status quo in the spirit of Dr. King and the treasonous insurrection witnessed at our nation's capital. The former was always characterized by nonviolence and love. The latter, what we saw in DC, was reflective of ignorance, fear, and hate incited by authoritarian interests. Activists committed to a radical agenda today have a tough challenge ahead, given how divided the country is. The white, moderate, liberal issue is as troublesome today as it was in Dr. King's time. Where do we go from here? From here, we can look to Dr. King as a beacon, not only for his radicalism, but for his pragmatism. Yes, moderate whites were troublesome, but King also knew that given the demographic and political realities, the cause needed them. It wasn't the book hunters that were the target, but it was movable, moderate white folk that needed to be brought on board. King, the pragmatist, though intimately aware of the pain Black folk experienced under the yoke of white supremacy, articulated, framed the civil rights issue in a way that forced white moderates to reckon with their moral selves and ultimately to support civil rights legislation instead of turning them away. Today, activists are confronted with a similar challenge. Given the demographic and political realities, a line must be negotiated. Activists must speak their truth, speak truth to power, but do so in a way that people will listen. Perhaps a pragmatic approach means having an awareness that changing minds is very delicate work. Being pragmatic might mean not expressing contempt for those people who don't yet agree with you. Because even if it's the truth, when you hurl it at someone, it will bounce rather than stick. In our community, we're seeing an activism that may not have the flash of big cities or that grabs the attention of major media outlets. But here, we are seeing a pragmatic activism that is shaping important conversations on social justice right here. We see, for instance, the work of groups like the Central Michigan Climate Solutions Summit, whose activism brought together voices from CMU and the wider Mount Pleasant community with the goal of discussing sustainable solutions to some of the most pressing environmental challenges of our time. We also see groups like the New America Project, the Citizens Climate Lobby, and the Refugee Outreach Collective, focusing on education and outreach in the interest of bringing progressive change to our community. The marches and protests that we have seen on TV, that we have witnessed in this state and in this very town, were heartening. The marches that were organized last summer by many members of our community was extraordinary given crowd size, despite Mount Pleasant's relatively low populated, predominantly white demographic. It was extraordinary because marches have an especially big impact in small, more rural towns, because they can shape conversations around social justice in a more immediate, intimate way as compared to very large cities. In the interest of pragmatism, activists can't just take to the streets to gain power. In rural small-town America, standard activist techniques, such as blocking the streets, in the long run, might not be effective because those folks are your neighbors. Dr. King and many other strategists in the movement never relied on just one tactic. an array of innovative tactics were always on the table. Speeches and marches had an important role, but they were not the only tactics used. Political action was critical. King embraced politics as essential to making change. Make no mistake, he never yielded to politics as usual. He was not afraid to criticize even his closest political allies. But all the same, he was willing to work with politicians. Many activists are highly skeptical of engaging with political institutions and processes, and that is understandable. Our political institutions, time and time again, have functioned as an apparatus of oppression. This is true. Yet, pragmatists, activists today know, just as Dr. King did, that you can't just take to the streets to gain power. In fact, today, protests are becoming an accepted byproduct of politics as usual. But in recent times, I feel encouraged by activists stepping up and engaging politically. At a time when forces conspire to disenfranchise younger, non-white voters, nonpartisan groups like Central Votes played a crucial role in registering and convincing hundreds of young people and students to vote. We also see young folk like our own Olivia Simon, who has spent much of her young life fighting for social justice, stepping up and running for local office. For my final point, I'd like to speak to one of my favorite quotes from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." The radical, that is Dr. King, pronounced a spiritual truth based on a faith in humanity and the belief that in the end, good conquers evil. Now, I know of a few activists who have reservations about that quote because they worry that it suggests that hard work is pointless simply because history is on their side. But the pragmatic Dr. King knew that the fight for social justice was the long game. He was playing chess, not checkers. His point was that success does not come overnight. Compromise, small gains, and setbacks were par for the course. At a time when many of us are feeling despair, we see the youth rising to the challenge, speaking up on behalf of the most vulnerable and on behalf of future generations. They reject the idea that they don't know enough or that they don't have the qualifications to make serious decisions. Many of our youth see the injustice and urgently want to change it. And quite frankly, at this time, we need youth-led activism now more than ever. They embody Dr. King's radicalism. Indeed, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, and our youth are doing the bending. Many of our youth activists today are having to constantly balance an unyielding desire for a better society with the reality that instant success is hardly assured. Not having quick wins can be especially frustrating, given that some activists may be here only for a short period of time. In the context of a small town like this, establishing an activism that is sustainable is the way to go. You may not see the promised land, but rest assured the groundwork is set for others to take the baton and finish the race. But regardless of race, regardless of age, if you are invested in a more just society, go ahead, embrace your radicalism. Dare to envision a beloved community based on justice, equal opportunity, and love, but also embody a pragmatism that gets things done, that changes hearts and minds, and that endures. Activists, let's move forward. Thank you.